The estate stood like a monument to silence. Perched upon a gentle rise and veiled each morning by a pale, reluctant mist, Blackthorn Manor possessed the kind of grandeur that inspired admiration from afar, yet unease upon approach. Its towering stone facade, adorned with ivy that clung as though it feared abandonment, reflected the dignity of generations long past, but within its walls lingered a chill no hearth could dispel. It was in this solemn residence that the young Duchess of Blackthorn had come to reside. At 23, she bore a beauty so delicate it seemed almost sorrowful. Her features were soft, her expressions quieter still, as though she had long ago learned that words, once spoken, could fall upon unyielding ears. Her name was spoken in society with admiration. Her grace, her refinement, her elegance, but rarely did anyone speak of her solitude. For though she was a duchess in title, she was a stranger in her own home. Her marriage to the Duke had been a matter of arrangement, not affection. It had been orchestrated with careful precision by families who valued lineage above sentiment, alliance above intimacy. On the day of their wedding, the cathedral had been filled with whispered approval, glittering jewels and polite smiles. The Duchess had entered adorned in ivory silk, her eyes lowered not merely from modesty, but from a quiet uncertainty she dared not voice. The Duke, a man of 30, stood as a figure carved from discipline and restraint. Handsome in the manner of classical sculpture, with sharp features and a gaze that seldom lingered, he commanded respect with little effort. His presence was imposing, his demeanor controlled, and his words, when he chose to offer them, were measured and few. If he possessed warmth, it was not a quality he shared. From the earliest days of their union, a distance had been established, subtle at first, then unmistakable. He fulfilled his duties as a husband with impeccable correctness. The Duchess was provided for, her needs anticipated before they could be spoken, her position secured beyond question. Yet there existed no tenderness in his attentions, no softness in his regard. She had come to understand with quiet resignation that she was not unloved, only never loved at all. Still she tried. In the early months she made gentle efforts to bridge the silence that lay between them. She would join him in the drawing room, her presence light and unobtrusive, hoping perhaps to invite conversation. She would inquire after his day with careful sincerity, offering a smile that lingered just long enough to suggest hope. The Duke would respond, always courteously, always distant. Yes, he might say. Or, the matter is handled. Or, there is nothing further to discuss. And so the silence returned. It became her companion. In time, the Duchess found solace where she could. The gardens, sprawling and meticulously maintained, became her refuge. There, among roses that bloomed with careless abundance, she allowed herself the smallest freedoms, moments where she could breathe without restraint. She would walk along the winding paths in the early hours, her gloved fingers brushing against petals, her thoughts unguarded for a fleeting while. It was said among the servants that the roses flourished more brightly since her arrival. They did not say why. Within the manor, her days followed a rhythm both structured and empty. She attended to her duties, received guests when required, and upheld every expectation placed upon her with flawless composure. Society saw her as the perfect duchess, graceful, poised, enviably serene. But perfection, she had learned, was often mistaken for contentment. At times, in the quiet of her private chambers, she would write letters. They were never sent. Each one began with careful formality and ended in something softer, something more fragile. Words she could not speak aloud found their way onto paper. Questions, hopes, confessions she scarcely allowed herself to fully feel. She wrote of small things, the way the morning light touched the eastern windows, the scent of rain upon the stone paths, the silence that seemed to echo even in crowded rooms. Once she wrote simply, "I wonder if you would ever see me not as I am expected to be but as I am." She folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it among the others. The Duke never knew. He moved through the manor like a figure untouched by its stillness, as though silence bent itself around him rather than clung to him. His days were occupied with affairs of estate and duty, his evenings often spent in his study, where the flicker of candlelight cast long shadows across polished wood. If he noticed her absence, he gave no sign. Yet there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when something in his composure wavered. Once, passing through the corridor adjoining the gardens, he glimpsed her standing among the roses. She was turned away from him, her posture relaxed in a way he had never seen within the confines of the house. The wind stirred the edges of her gown, and for a brief instant she seemed not a duchess, but simply a young woman alone with her thoughts. He paused. Only for a moment. Then, as though correcting an error, he continued on without a word. Such moments were rare, and rarer still were the thoughts they stirred. For the Duke was a man who had long ago learned to master himself. Emotion in his world was a liability, affection an indulgence. He had been raised to value control above all else, and he carried that lesson with unwavering discipline. If there existed within him any capacity for tenderness, it lay buried beneath years of careful restraint. And yet, the Duchess's presence unsettled something he could not name. Not enough to change, but enough to notice. It was on an evening touched by the faintest hint of autumn that the fragile equilibrium of their lives began to shift. The air carried a subtle chill, and the manner seemed quieter than usual, as though anticipating a change it could not yet comprehend. The Duchess sat in the drawing-room, a book resting unopened in her lap. Her gaze was distant, her expression thoughtful in a way that suggested a decision long in the making. When the Duke entered, she rose at once, as was her habit. "My lord," she greeted softly. He inclined his head in acknowledgment, setting aside his gloves with deliberate care. There was nothing unusual in his manner, nothing to suggest that this evening would differ from any other. And yet, something in her stillness gave him pause. "Is there something you require?" he asked. It was a simple question. Routine. Expected. But the Duchess did not answer at once. Instead, she gathered a quiet courage that had been forming, unseen, within her for many months. Her hands clasped gently before her, though the faint tremor in her fingers betrayed the effort it cost her to remain composed. "There is something I wish to ask," she said. The Duke regarded her, his expression unreadable. "Speak." She met his gaze then, truly met it for perhaps the first time. And in her eyes there was no accusation, no demand, only a quiet, aching sincerity. "Do you believe," she began, her voice steady despite its softness, "that affection may grow where it was not first planted?" The question lingered between them, fragile and dangerous in equal measure. For a moment the Duke said nothing. And in that silence, something unseen began to fracture. The question did not leave the room. It lingered, fragile, suspended between them like a glass ornament that neither dared to touch, for fear it might shatter beyond repair. The Duchess stood with quiet composure, though her heart trembled beneath the stillness she so carefully maintained. The Duke, by contrast, remained immovable, his gaze fixed upon her as though attempting to discern something that refused to reveal itself. "Do you believe," she had asked, "that affection may grow where it was not first planted?" It was not a question of idle curiosity. It was not even, in truth, a question at all. It was a confession disguised in restraint. The Duke turned away. Not abruptly, nor with visible agitation, but with a measured deliberation that suggested control rather than avoidance. He moved toward the hearth, where the fire burned low, casting uneven light across the room. For a moment, he regarded the flames as though they might offer an answer more suitable than any he could give. "Affection," he said at last, "is not a matter of cultivation, Your Grace. It is either present, or it is not." His tone was even, detached, final. The Duchess felt the words settle within her, not as a wound freshly struck, but as something colder, something that confirmed what she had long suspected, yet still hoped to disprove. "I see," she replied softly. But she did not move. She did not retreat into silence as she so often had. Instead she took a step forward. The Duke noticed. There was something in her manner that evening, something quiet yet resolute, that unsettled him more than any display of emotion could have. She did not plead. She did not accuse. And yet, her presence carried a weight that pressed against the carefully ordered boundaries of his composure. "May I ask," she continued, her voice steady, "if it was ever your intention that it might become so?" He turned then, his expression sharpening almost imperceptibly. "You speak as though intention governed such matters. Does it not?" she asked. There was no defiance in her tone. Only sincerity. And it was that sincerity, so unguarded, so unyielding in its quietness, that stirred something dangerously unfamiliar within him. The Duke drew a slow breath. "You were aware of the nature of our arrangement," he said. "It was not concealed from you." "No," she agreed. "It was not." "Then I fail to understand the purpose of this inquiry." For the first time, there was a trace of impatience in his voice. The Duchess lowered her gaze briefly, as though steadying herself against a rising tide she could no longer suppress. "The purpose," she said, "is understanding." He said nothing. She continued. "I have endeavored, since the day of our marriage, to fulfill my role with diligence. I have asked little, required less, and expected nothing beyond what was given. Yet, she hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of what remained to be said. Yet I find myself wondering if I have mistaken indifference for inevitability. The words, though gently spoken, carried a quiet force. The Duke's expression hardened. You mistake nothing, he replied. The finality in his tone might have ended the conversation. But not this time. Then it is indifference, she said. It was not an accusation. It was an acknowledgement. Something in him recoiled. Must every silence be given a name? He asked, his voice colder now. Must every absence be interpreted as neglect? No, she answered. But neither should it be mistaken for contentment. The fire crackled softly between them. Outside, the wind had begun to stir, brushing against the tall windows with a low, restless sound. The air in the room seemed to shift, as though the very walls had grown attentive to what passed between husband and wife. The Duke stepped away from the hearth. You presume much, he said. Do I? She asked. And then, quietly, without ornament or defense, she spoke the truth she had carried alone for far too long. I do not ask for grand affection, she said, nor for declarations that do not come naturally to you. I ask only to know whether I stand before you as a companion, or merely as an obligation. The words settled into the space between them, heavy with meaning. For a moment the Duke said nothing. And in that silence, something within him stirred, something dangerously close to recognition. He saw, not the Duchess adorned for society, nor the figure who moved gracefully through the expectations of their world, but the woman herself. The quiet persistence of her efforts. The dignity with which she had borne his distance. The absence of complaint where complaint would have been justified. And for the briefest instant he faltered. It was subtle. Invisible to any but himself. But it was enough to frighten him. For what rose in that moment was not indifference, but the undeniable suggestion of its opposite. He turned away sharply. You speak as though you have been wronged, he said, his voice tightening with a restraint that bordered on severity. And yet I have provided for you in every manner required. You have, she said gently. Then what is it you seek, he demanded. What deficiency remains that compels you to press this matter further? The Duchess lifted her gaze once more. And this time there was no hesitation. You, she said. The single word struck with more force than any accusation. The Duke's composure cracked. Not visibly, not in a way that would betray him to another, but within, where control was most fiercely guarded, something fractured under the weight of her simplicity. It was intolerable. You presume beyond your station, he said, the edge in his voice now unmistakable. Affection cannot be summoned by request, nor imposed by expectation. I have imposed nothing, she replied. I have only remained. And that, he said sharply, has been your choice. The words hung between them. A silence followed, one not of quiet understanding but of something far more dangerous. The Duchess did not flinch. No, she said at last. It has been my hope. Something in that answer, so unguarded, so impossibly sincere, became the breaking point. The Duke turned to face her fully, his restraint unraveling not into chaos, but into something colder, sharper, and far more destructive. Hope, he repeated as though the word itself were an affront. Then allow me to relieve you of it. The Duchess stood very still. The storm beyond the windows had begun in earnest now, rain striking the glass in restless patterns, wind rising with a low, unrelenting force. The fire flickered, casting shadows that seemed to lengthen and distort across the walls. And then he said it. Each word deliberate. Each syllable final. Leave before sunrise, the Duke said. I never loved you. The world did not shatter. It did not cry out, nor did it tremble beneath the weight of what had been spoken. It simply fell silent. The Duchess did not gasp. She did not plead. For a moment she did not move at all. Then very slowly she inclined her head. As you wish, she said. Her voice did not break. That, more than anything, unsettled him. He had expected resistance. Emotion. Something that might justify the harshness of his words. But she offered none. Only acceptance. She turned then, her movements composed, her steps measured as she crossed the room. She did not look back. She did not speak again. The door closed behind her with a softness that seemed wholly at odds with the violence of what had passed. And she was gone. The Duke remained where he stood. The storm raged on. For several moments he did not move. Then, with deliberate calm, he returned to the hearth and adjusted the fire, as though restoring order to the room might restore order within himself. But the silence that followed was not the same. It had changed. Somewhere deep within the stillness, something irreversible had taken root. And though he did not yet understand it, the words he had spoken would not remain confined to that room. They would follow him into every silence that remained. The night did not end, it merely grew quieter. Long after the storm had exhausted its fury and the rain softened into a faint, lingering whisper against the windows, the Duchess remained awake. Not a single candle burned within her chamber, yet she did not seek light. Darkness, in its stillness, offered a strange and solemn comfort, one that required no composure, no pretense, no quiet endurance. She sat by the window, her hands resting gently in her lap, her gaze unfixed as though turned inward rather than outward. The Duke's words did not echo, they did not need to. They had settled within her with a finality that required no repetition. Leave before sunrise, I never loved you. There was no anger in her heart. That, perhaps, was the most extraordinary thing of all. There was sorrow, certainly, deep and unyielding, but it was not the sharp, burning pain of betrayal. It was something quieter. Something that felt, in its own way, inevitable. She had asked for truth, and she had received it. For a time, she simply remained there, listening to the slow passage of the night. The manor, so often defined by its silence, now seemed almost reverent in its stillness, as though it too bore witness to what must come next. At last she rose. There was no urgency in her movements. No hesitation either. She crossed the room and opened the small writing desk that stood near the hearth, her fingers brushing lightly against its polished surface before she seated herself. She did not pause to consider what she would write. The words came as they always had, quietly, without demand, shaped not by expectation but by truth. My lord. She stopped. For a moment, her hand remained suspended above the page. Then, slowly she continued. By the time you read this, I shall have honored your request. There was no bitterness in the line. No reproach. Only acceptance. I regret only that my presence has caused you discomfort, for it was never my intention to impose upon you that which you did not freely give. The pen moved steadily, though her breath faltered once, only once, before she regained her composure. I believed, perhaps foolishly, that time and patience might soften what distance had first created. That affection, though absent, might yet find its way into being. A faint tremor touched the edge of the ink, but she did not stop. Seems I was mistaken. The candle at her side flickered faintly as though stirred by an unseen breath. She continued. Know that I bear you no resentment. You have been, in all ways that matter to the world, a most honorable husband. That I desired more than honor was never a fault I expected you to answer for. Her hand slowed then, the weight of what remained pressing gently, insistently upon her. And yet, she did not turn away from it. I loved you. The words were simple, unadorned, entire. She did not attempt to soften them, nor did she linger upon them. Not with expectation, nor with demand, but with sincerity, and perhaps a measure of hope that was never mine to keep. She drew a quiet breath. I leave you now with the only thing I possess that may yet bring you peace, my absence. The final line came without hesitation. May you find in your life that which I could not be for you. She signed nothing more than her name. No title. No formality. When she had finished, she folded the letter with care and sealed it. For a moment, she held it in her hands, her gaze resting upon its surface as though committing something unseen to memory. Then she placed it upon the desk where it would not be overlooked. There were no tears. Only a stillness that felt, in its own quiet way, complete. The hour before dawn approached. She dressed not in the finery expected of her station, but in something simpler, something that would not draw notice. A cloak of soft gray, its fabric unremarkable, concealed her form as she moved through the chamber one final time. Her gaze lingered upon small things. The chair by the window. The untouched book. The letters she had written and never sent. She did not take them. Some things, she understood, belonged to the past even before one left them behind. When at last she opened the door, the corridor beyond lay empty. The manor, vast and unyielding, seemed unaware of her departure. No servant stirred. No sound marked her passing. It was as though she had already become a memory. Step by step, she descended the grand staircase, her movements light enough that even the ancient wood beneath her feet offered no protest. The great doors at the entrance stood closed, their heavy form a final boundary between what had been and what would follow. She did not hesitate. The cold air greeted her with quiet indifference as she stepped beyond the threshold. The sky was pale with the first suggestion of dawn, the horizon touched with a faint, reluctant light. She did not look back. And then she was gone. Morning came as it always did. The Duke rose at his usual hour, the events of the previous evening set aside with the same discipline he applied to all matters that threatened to linger. His movements were precise, his routine unchanged. If there existed within him any awareness of what he had said, of what he had commanded, it remained buried beneath habit and control. It was only when he entered the drawing room that something felt different. He could not have said what it was. The room was as it had always been. The furnishings untouched, the light filtering through tall windows in soft, measured streams. And yet, there was an absence, subtle, indefinable. He dismissed it. At least he attempted to. "Her Grace has not yet come down?" he asked, his tone casual, directed toward the servant who stood nearby. "No, Your Grace," came the reply. "We have not seen her this morning." Pause. "Very well." He turned away. But the unease remained. It followed him through the corridor, through the study, through the quiet rituals of his morning. It was not concern, he did not name it as such. It was merely a disruption. A deviation from the expected order of things. And yet it persisted. At last, with a faint irritation he did not examine too closely, he made his way toward her chamber. He did not knock. The door opened with ease. The room within was orderly, undisturbed. The bed untouched, the air faintly cool as though it had not been occupied through the night. The Duke stepped inside. And for the first time something within him shifted. "Your Grace?" he called. No answer. His gaze moved across the room, taking in each detail with increasing precision. The absence was no longer subtle. It was complete. Then he saw it. The letter. Placed upon the desk with deliberate care. He approached it slowly, as though the act of doing so might confirm something he was not yet prepared to acknowledge. When he took it in hand, the seal bore no crest, only the quiet finality of its purpose. He broke it open, and read. At first his expression did not change. The words were received with the same composure he applied to all written matters. But as his gaze moved from line to line, something in that composure began to falter. Not outwardly, but within. "I loved you." The words did not accuse. They did not plead. They simply existed. And in their simplicity, they revealed everything he had refused to see. The room seemed suddenly larger, emptier. His grip on the letter tightened. The silence pressed in. And for the first time since her arrival, since her presence had quietly, persistently filled the spaces he had never thought to examine, the Duke understood what it meant for something to be gone. Not dismissed. Not set aside. But lost. Irretrievably. He looked around the chamber once more, as though expecting to find some trace of her that had escaped notice. But there was nothing. Only absence. Only silence. And the unmistakable, unyielding realization that the quiet he had once preferred was no longer bearable. In the days that followed, Blackthorn Manor did not change. And yet, nothing within it remained the same. The Duke resumed his routine with unwavering precision. Each morning unfolded as it always had. Each duty was met, each expectation fulfilled. To any observer, there was no visible alteration in his manner, no indication that anything of consequence had occurred. But the manner itself betrayed him. For silence, once an ally, had become something else entirely. It lingered not as absence but as presence, heavy, insistent, impossible to ignore. It settled in the corridors where her footsteps no longer sounded, in the drawing room where her quiet figure no longer sat, in the gardens where the roses bloomed with indifferent beauty. He noticed everything. And that was the beginning of his undoing. At first it was the smallest of things. A chair left untouched. A book resting where it had last been held but never opened again. The faint imprint of habit, hers, upon a life that no longer contained her. He found himself pausing where once he would have passed without thought. Lingering where there had once been no reason to remain. The letter did not leave him. He carried it, though he could not have said why. It remained folded within his coat, its edges softening with time, its words etched more deeply into his memory with each passing day. "I loved you." It was not reproach that haunted him. It was truth. He had read the letter more times than he would ever admit, each reading revealing something he had not allowed himself to see before. Not because it had been hidden, but because he had chosen not to look. He began to remember. Not in grand gestures, for there had been none. But in fragments. The way she had greeted him each evening, her voice soft but unwavering. The quiet persistence of her presence in rooms he had not wished to share. The gentleness with which she had occupied a space that had never truly welcomed her. He remembered the gardens. How often had he seen her there, moving among the roses with a stillness that seemed almost like belonging. He had thought it inconsequential then, a preference perhaps or a habit born of leisure. Now he understood. It had been refuge. And he had never asked why she needed one. The realization came not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow and merciless unfolding. Each memory sharpened what had once been blurred. Each detail, once dismissed, returned with a clarity that allowed no escape. He had not been unaware. He had been unwilling. And that difference, so slight in appearance, so vast in consequence, became the measure of his regret. Weeks passed. Then months. Searches were made. Discreet at first, then with growing urgency. Servants were questioned, travelers consulted, inquiries sent beyond the immediate reach of the estate. Descriptions were offered, routes suggested, possibilities considered and discarded. No trace was found. It was as though she had dissolved into the world without leaving even the faintest imprint of her passing. Rumors inevitably began to circulate. Some spoke of a young woman seen traveling alone, her bearing too refined for her circumstances. Others claimed she had taken refuge in distant lands, or that illness had claimed her not long after her departure. None could be confirmed. And the uncertainty proved more relentless than any certainty could have been. For if she lived beyond his reach. And if she did not, he did not allow the thought to complete itself. The seasons turned. Autumn yielded to winter, and winter, in time, relinquished its hold. The estate endured as it always had, its grandeur untouched by the quiet erosion taking place within its master. The Duke changed. Not outwardly, not in ways that would invite comment or speculation. But in the solitude he once commanded with ease, something restless had taken root. He began to walk the halls at hours he had once reserved for rest, his steps echoing through the stillness as though in search of something he could not name. The drawing room, once a place of passing necessity, became a space he lingered in without purpose. And the gardens? The gardens became something else entirely. He went there often. At first without intention. Then with something approaching compulsion. He stood where she had once stood. Walked the paths she had once traced with quiet familiarity. The roses bloomed as they always had, untouched, unchanging in their beauty. But he saw them differently now. Not as ornament, but as witness. He would pause beside them, his gaze lingering upon petals that seemed far too delicate to endure the weight of memory they now carried. And in those moments when the world narrowed to silence and scent, he would almost hear her. Not in voice, not in sound, but in presence. A suggestion of movement where there was none. A stillness that felt shared. Whether it was memory or imagination he did not question. He did not wish to. For in those fleeting instants the emptiness receded. And he could pretend, if only for a moment, that she had not entirely gone. Years passed. Time, indifferent and unrelenting, moved forward as it always does. The world beyond the estate shifted, adapted, forgot. But within Blackthorn Manor, memory endured. The letter remained. Worn now, its folds softened, its ink faintly faded, but no less powerful in its quiet declaration. He had come to know each word not merely by sight but by heart. It was the only truth he had allowed himself to keep. On a morning much like the one she had left, he stood once more at the threshold of the estate. The air was cool, touched with the same pale light that heralded the coming dawn. The horizon stretched before him, vast and unchanging, its silence echoing something far deeper than the absence of sound. This was the hour she had chosen. Or rather, the hour he had given her. He had not thought of it then. Not truly. It had been a command. A dismissal. A means of restoring order to something he had not wished to confront. Now it stood as something else entirely. A moment. A single, irrevocable moment upon which everything that followed had come to rest. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed upon the distant line where earth met sky. "I was wrong," he said. The words were quiet. Carried not by expectation nor by hope, but by the simple necessity of being spoken. There was no answer. There would never be one. "I did not understand," he continued, his voice steady despite the weight it bore. "What it was you offered, or what it meant to refuse it." The wind stirred faintly, brushing against his coat, carrying with it the scent of the gardens behind him. "I believed it weakness," he said. "To feel, to yield to something beyond reason." His hand tightened slightly around the letter he still held. It was not weakness. The silence remained unchanged. And yet he spoke again. "I loved you." The words came too late. He knew it. Not as regret alone, but as truth finally recognized in its entirety. And it was that recognition, clear, undeniable, and forever beyond remedy, that became his burden to bear. The sun rose slowly upon the horizon, its light gentle, unassuming, as though unaware of the weight it illuminated. The Duke did not move. He remained where he stood, the letter held carefully, reverently, as though it were the only thing that tethered him to what had once been. And in that quiet, unyielding dawn, he understood at last that some goodbyes are not endings. They are sentences. And he would live within his for the rest of his days.